Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to this afternoon's session in the second day of the program of the Middle East Librarians Association annual meeting. My name is Robin Daugherty, and I am the librarian for Middle East Studies at Yale. And I was the program chair putting this program all together for you guys to enjoy. But I will, after I introduce our host, I will let this session run itself, and my guests will take over. So we are here today for a panel entirely organized by the Center for Research Libraries in Chicago. The theme of the panel, as you can see on the slide, is International and Area Studies Collections in the Post-COVID Academic Environment, Prospects for Cooperative Collection Development. And my friends at CRL have invited a number of distinguished speakers to offer their responses and interventions on this very, very important topic. So I would like to hand this over now to Judy.
Thank you, Robin, and thanks to everyone who is joining this session. I will definitely understand as you mute your microphones and make yourselves invisible. I'm sure many are eating lunch or otherwise snacking. So we're glad to see you all today.
Okay, Judy, your voice is breaking up again, so just be careful.
I'll shout. Thank you. To introduce myself, my name is Judy Alspaugh, and I am the Area Studies Program Manager at the Center for Research Libraries. CRL is an international consortium of university, college, and independent research libraries collectively building, stewarding, and sharing a wealth of resource materials from all world regions to support inspired research and teaching. CRL's deep and diverse collections are shaped by specialists at major US and Canadian research universities who work together to identify and preserve collections and content to ensure its long-term integrity and accessibility to researchers worldwide. At this session, entitled International and Area Studies Collections in the Post-COVID Academic Environment, Prospects for Cooperative Collection Development, I'm pleased to have a distinguished group of participants to discuss timely and important matters for Middle East Studies librarians. The global pandemic has dramatically accelerated an existing crisis in research library collecting. The near-term restrictions of the global supply of published literature, particularly material that is produced in print, will be exacerbated by economic contractions in the publishing landscape, as well as in library budgets. Those circumstances are still in flux on campuses across the United States and Canada. COVID-19 will likely have long-term impacts on the availability of research materials for scholarship in North America and beyond. Those responsible for collecting international and area studies material have expressed alarm at impending budget cuts that threaten to endanger the production of knowledge in the region. This potential loss imperils the collective mission of our institutions to ensure continuing access to cultural heritage and undermines the values of diversity of collections and research perspectives to support intellectual inquiry. Cuts to international collecting, if enacted without regard to the collective whole, may result in irrevocable loss of research resources for future scholarship. Today's panel of members of the Area Studies community will discuss challenges and opportunities from the Middle East collection perspective. We have invited 5 panelists to discuss these topics today. Our aim was to include panelists that represented diverse institutions and hold various responsibilities within these institutions. So most of you today probably already know our Middle East Studies librarians colleagues, including Mohamed from the University of California, Berkeley, Evyn Kropf from the University of Michigan, and Marlis Saleh from the University of Chicago. Additionally, we are pleased to have with us 2 administrators who both have deep experience and strong commitment to area studies, who can share a different perspective, although we have asked them to relate their comments as much as possible to the impact of library policies and strategies on Middle East Studies collection development. We welcome with us today Michael Brewer from the University of Arizona and Matt Marostica from Stanford University. And to moderate the question and answer period, and also to sum up our conversation today, I'm happy to welcome James Simon, who's my colleague at the Center for Research Libraries. For this session, we have planned a robust conversation among our panelists, which we expect to take about an hour. I'll have questions for them and then they will respond in turn. If you have questions during that time, you may type them into the chat, and James will monitor the chat and pose those questions at an appropriate time to the panelists. We'd ask that you keep your line muted during the panelist conversation, so for the next hour. Once we enter the discussion portion of the session, about an hour from now, James will then moderate. At that time, we hope that you will contribute your questions, observations, and experiences. You may signal your interest in speaking by using the raise hand functionality, which you can find by clicking on, see where it says participants at the bottom of the screen. So once you click on that, there's a sidebar along the right, and you can see a spot that says raise hand. So James will call on folks in turn to unmute their lines at that time. So with that, let's get started. My first question, and I'm going to turn it over to Matt first. First question is, what collection development policies that impact Middle East studies materials have been implemented at your institution as a result of the pandemic? And have these policies been adjusted since the beginning of the crisis? Matt, take it away.
Thank you, Judy, and thank you for the great introduction to the topic today. And I want to tell everyone, I'm a Latin Americanist. I am deeply committed to area studies, and policies that I had to enact on I'll start with the budget, are going to have not just terrible effects in the short term, but I do believe are going to make our collecting in the long term very difficult and put us in a position where we really do have to work together to ensure that there are sufficient, that there are still great resources available to researchers in the US and Canada. And so I'll start with the budget impact first. We last year at the Stanford Libraries took a 13% budget cut for this fiscal year that we are now in. But that doesn't even get at how difficult the budget situation is for us in the short term, because we also had $800,000 in collection funds impounded by the provost during the previous fiscal year. And the impact on area studies has been tremendous. Of the $800,000 that was impounded by the provost, about a little over a quarter was area studies money, and sadly, 50,000, maybe 45, were Middle East funds that just happened to be there in March when the provost demanded, funds returned by the libraries. So having to implement a 13% cut this year for this fiscal year meant taking a disproportionate amount of funds from area studies. We cut, and you have to think about these cuts as permanent, $800,000 from base budgets in area studies. That meant a 20% cut to our Middle East program. Others of our programs took up to a 50% cut. And again, I don't know, there's no mechanism by which those funds are going to be magically restored in some future budget. I think that maybe in 3 years, universities are in a position to slowly begin to increase collection funds, but by that time, who knows what's going to happen to the markets. I also want to point out that the disproportionate hits to area studies came in part because we had to focus on e-resources, and there are fewer e-resources. When you don't have people on campus, but you want to give them access to materials, you have to do it via e-resources. And so we prioritized e-resources, and that meant print suffered tremendously. Of course, there are some good justifications for that because we couldn't process the print material anyway. We did not have people on campus to process materials from the middle of March through the beginning of July is when we had people really back and able to get going. And I know that some of our other peer institutions still are not kind of fully geared up on processing. We are now starting to really process materials. Now, we rely in Middle East, we rely on a vendor to help us process some of our backlog. They have not been able to contribute to our processing up until now. We're in discussions with them that maybe they can start up again at the beginning of the new year. So processing is impossible. Our budgets have been devastated, and that's the situation we find ourselves in. And I think my 5 minutes are up.
Thanks very much. So now let's hear from Marlis about collection development policies impacting collecting at the University of Chicago.
Excuse me. So I'm Marlis Saleh. Well, as Judy said, I'm the bibliographer for Middle Eastern Studies at the University of Chicago. So I'll talk a little bit about, so Matt sort of gave the looking down view. I'll sort of talk about from, the bottom, the person actually, doing the selection. So we, like everyone else, in March, middle of March, basically our physical library closed down. We all left, and most of us have not yet come back. So our sort of immediate focus at that time had to be, so no one had any access to the physical collections. We didn't, and we certainly, the patrons didn't, no one had any access. So we had to do what we immediately could to scramble around and get electronic access as much as possible, especially for the quarter that was still ongoing. Everybody was suddenly off campus. We had to see what electronic resources there were. And of course, we're all familiar. There was the Hadi Trust, yay for them. That was great. Some of the publishers gave temporary access. So we kind of were focused on that. But then we had to, even while this was going on, we had to still think about, we're so focused on the immediate needs, but there's still the ongoing, there's always that balance between immediate needs and the ongoing collection. And so those of us who are, fortunate to have sort of distinctive collections, we really have to keep that in mind, and we have to do what we can, not to let that unduly suffer as much as we can. Now the good thing, our library, of course, again, we had our money was frozen, but it was not taken, like Matt was saying, that the provost actually took their money away. It's rather horrifying. So we had our individual budgets were frozen, but the library held on to it. So we were suddenly, those of us who still had money to spend for that fiscal year, suddenly that was sort of taken away from us. But the lucky thing at our library is that we have a separate fund that pays for materials that are going to be put on reserve. So we didn't have to worry about that. The good thing is that we were still, all of our orders that were in process, we were able to continue those orders. We were able to, and I'm talking not about the sort of North American orders, but our colleagues in the Middle East. We consulted with them. They let us know that they were able to accept our orders and pile up our materials that we had ordered, even though we could not receive them because there was nobody was in the building to receive any shipments. But luckily, our library allowed us to pay for those orders, even though we had not received them, which is against, you know, our usual process is that when we receive an order, we pay for it. So we really appreciated the fact that the library understood that that would pose a lot of difficulties for our suppliers overseas. So we were able to pay for them. And another good thing that our library did was that even though they, you know, of course, everybody, as Matt told us, suddenly you have to, you know, everything is supposed to be E. We have to focus on E resources because that's the only thing that anybody can access. But our library allowed us as the selectors we still have the discretion of what we purchased. So oftentimes for Middle Eastern materials, there is no alternative. If it's a European publisher or a North American publisher, perhaps we have the option of an E or a print book. Most of the time for the materials that we get from overseas, that's not an option at all. So we still maintain the option to purchase the print books from overseas. And so right now, excuse me, right now it's sort of, you know, here we are. We're talking about the post-COVID era, but we're still in the COVID area. I mean, we haven't even gone beyond that yet. So right now we have to focus on what we can do now, but we can't lose sight of the future, and we can't lose sight of our obligations to maintain these distinctive collections that we have for those of us who have that option. So even now, when I have the option to get a print volume or an e-volume, I stop and think, because for one thing, the e-volume probably costs 3 times as much, you know, and now if I bought the E1, that's 3 other books that I perhaps could have gotten. So I think if somebody needs something right this very minute, perhaps it needs to be E. But as we sort of return, you know, the staff returns to the building, we're able now to begin re-accessing our print collections. I think we have to think more carefully about just automatically and reflexively getting an E version. And I just wanted to mention sort of on this subject, many or most of you, I'm sure, are familiar with our MELA statement on collection development, access, and equity in the time of COVID-19. If you're not, you should have a look at it on the MELA website. It's really quite well done. And it was sort of in response to, was somebody helpfully pulling it up? Oh, thank you. It was sort of in response to the Latin American equivalent of MELA, which I would imagine that Matt here is a member of, who really were sort of in the forefront of this. And it touches on a lot of really useful aspects, you know, particularly on collection development, which we're talking about today, but also access and equity. And just very briefly, the fact that e-resources, the focus on e-resources causes a big problem for those of us in Middle Eastern studies, because there aren't e-resources many times. I think I'll end here and pass it along to, I believe Mohamed is coming next, and Mohamed will discuss his view on this.
Thank you, Marlis, and thank you everyone for including me in this interesting panel. It is difficult and tough to actually talk about budget cuts and problems and give kind of thoughts, even when we are still in the middle of the pandemic. Actually, we are not out of it yet, so we are still trying to get something done correctly during that time. Hopefully we are doing that. So similar to actually what Matt said and what Marlis also confirmed, that in our university as well, in my university, Berkeley, and I believe in the UC system as well, we had to face also budget cuts. Our cut actually in our in our specific case for this specific fiscal year is about 17%, and we were told that this is something that we need to think about as a permanent cut. However, we still hope that there would become some kind of a change in the future that will enhance that situation a little bit. Hopefully, we'll see. But we have to think about it as a permanent cut, as Matt said. For Berkeley in particular, when the pandemic started, it was in March, and I think California was one of the first states to close down everything, and we closed in March completely. Everyone went home. And we have been ordered to not to request any print materials at this time. And we stopped all these shipments and stopped everything because the university was completely shut down. So there was no anyone actually to receive resources or to receive materials from the Middle East. Even those orders that were in the pipeline, some materials left the vendor's warehouse to campus. We were not allowed actually even to really think about where to host them or save them or store them. So I believe they were kept for a couple of months in somewhere in the storage house in Oakland until we resumed receiving resources as well. So I think we started again in June or July to receive resources, print resources. And recently, about last month or so, we also have been asked to resume print ordering. Around the time where it was from March to June, July, was the focus was completely on e-collections, and most of the resources should be E, and we need to order materials in E and all of that. It was definitely a problematic situation for anyone who works with Middle East, because basically there is no that much of E in Middle East resources. So the work completely was probably on non-Middle East language materials, non-vernacular, not ordering. There is no print and there is no online resources for Arabic, Persian, and not so much for Hebrew and Turkish and all of that. So basically, we were spending our budget for resources that we know that could be useful or needed for faculty and researchers on campus on foreign language materials. I would say foreign from the Middle East point of view, which is English, French, German, all of these resources, not in Middle East languages. So this was a situation until we actually were told to go ahead and resume print again. So this was the good thing that actually the university was able to do as well, and the library worked well with the university in doing that, is to secure specific essential staff to go in the library to resume receiving print resources and doing some kind of imaging so catalogers can work from home and all of that. So this is what actually is the situation right now in Berkeley. With that said, actually the print is still kind of coming forward. However, receiving it still an issue because it takes a longer time than usually because there is no catalogers. We still need to go through imaging and essential staff only, which means that very limited time and very limited number of staff go to campus to do the imaging so catalogers can work. So in this case, it is going slow. However, it is going. So I'm happy that it's still going, but it's going slow. E is still a preference for the university. And as Marlis said, it costs a lot of money to get one E version of a specific book versus print. And this is actually the preference would go if there is a print versus E, but in our case for Middle East studies, there is no E version. So it is that situation that I can actually say about what we have here at Berkeley in particular. And now I think I can pass it to Evyn to give us her thoughts about that as well.
Thank you, Mohamed. So at the University of Michigan, we have likewise been, as a university, heavily impacted, particularly because of our tie to state funding and also our reliance on our health system and revenue, which is generated by our health system. But frankly, we have been very fortunate, and the impacts to the library general fund and collection budget have been relatively modest. We have adopted several higher level strategies, such as eliminating duplicate spending where possible, streamlining subscription costs by format, canceling duplicate subscriptions, converting from online plus print to simply online in some cases. Also negotiating with vendors to rein in or even eliminate the usual inflation increases. Negotiating to secure renewal deals. Very pleased myself to have been successful in this area in one of my liaison duties. And with respect, deep respect and admiration to all the vendors who are on this call. We appreciate your understanding of our situations. Other strategies have included deals on electronic titles accessed while physical copies have been out of reach, or folks have been less inclined to work with those physical copies, larger package deals, identifying subscription cancellations for big ticket electronic resources. We have a team approach to managing those. For example, I'm on the General Reference and Popular Press e-team, and we have in turn made an attempt to contribute where we can to free that ready cash. In addition to, of course, the hiring freezes, travel spending freezes, pretty much most most other how to say peripheral operating expenditure. Although as we will discuss, I think further on, travel is actually really crucial to our collection development. So more technical services and processing impacts. I would say we have seen then sort of institutional collection development policies, because to be honest, we are encouraged to continue collecting print. We are, the importance of print is emphasized to us, and we are encouraged to continue acquiring. But of course, the inability to accept deliveries, as several of my colleagues have already mentioned, or the inability for our vendors to even ship out of Iran, for example, where commercial flights and other flights were simply not taking place, and so the ability to bring materials out of Iran was very much hampered for several months. Also impacts on receipt and arriving of these physical materials, and of course the ability to pay invoices. We much more experienced this sort of impact, and this required development of new procedures and negotiation, which has ultimately been successful, that funds be held, so to speak, or even carried over from, again, the one fiscal year to the other in order to cover delayed arrivals, payment, etc. And of course, we require new workflows to ensure that received materials could be cataloged, which is absolutely crucial. And so very fortunately, we have much of this now worked out. We have also seen a service collection access impacts, given that physical access has been limited, only slowly ramped up, as our workflows for retrieval, for delivery from on-site storage, for contactless pickup, requesting, all of this has been worked out. And of course, this is in part owing to an abundance of caution, which is wholly appropriate in light of library worker impacts. the technical access impacts actually affect more, I think, what we choose to acquire, particularly when a request comes in, because we're thinking about when will it become accessible, and what in what manner would the requesting colleague choose to access the item. In many ways, for us, collection access is actually enhanced because of ETAS, the HathiTrust emergency temporary access service, because we have a significant number of materials in HathiTrust, including many important studies, government publications, and periodicals published in Egypt, for example, in Lebanon, in Iran, in Turkey. And it is now possible to full text search many of these materials, even for Arabic script languages. And this has been especially valuable for navigating historical monographs and magazine archives, for example. So we are experiencing a mix of impacts, if you will.
Thank you, Evyn. So this first section, we were addressing both what are the policy changes, and then what changes have you made in your own practice to sort of respond to the policy changes that have come about due to the pandemic and the resulting financial crisis. So I just wanted to sort of circle back and see if Marlis and or Mohamed in turn had anything they wanted to add regarding their own work and their response to this, or whether they included that in their remarks already. Was there anything you wanted to add? First Marlis and then Mohamed, please.
Well, I would just, I basically touched on it, but I would just say sort of the crucial question now, or one of the big questions now seems to be, you know, e or print. And, you know, as we all know, e has many wonderful qualities, but it also has drawbacks. And one of the drawbacks that I would sort of point out, which may come up at some point, is the fact that it's still at this point virtually impossible or very difficult to share e-resources. You know, if we have a print book, we can loan it to who, you know, any place all around. If we have an ebook, that's basically going to be locked down only to our own patrons. So that again is, you know, if we're thinking broadly and altruistically for the whole library community, that's another aspect of E that I would just bring up. Mohamed?
Yes, I definitely agree with that. And even I would like to add that if we do not have the print copy, we would not be able to access the HathiTrust ETAS version of it. This is definitely the situation. If you don't own a copy, you can't really access it in HathiTrust. So having a print copy in the collection is an essential aspect of what we are doing to even allow us to access it online in the pandemic situation. But I would like also to add something about what I personally have made during the change situation and all of that. It was kind of my intention about a couple of years ago to actually look at what is available in E format from the Middle East. Whatever is available, and especially if there is kind of an availability was for a long time about a service that is provided for more than 10 years, databases that are available for that specific time coming from a well-known institution, well-established institution, a country kind of is also kind of not so much of troubles and complications going on. So I looked at that and I was able to get the specific databases from the Middle East that are online, providing online access to resources. I can here list examples of that, but actually this is just in general. So when the pandemic happened, our faculty and researchers in the university were able to at least get some use of the materials that from the Middle East. This includes journal articles in Arabic from a specific database, journal articles in Persian from other databases, ebooks from specific databases, and so on. So it was kind of in that situation. So when the pandemic happened, I felt like at least our researchers have access to something. Definitely, this is not all what we can provide or all what we want them to actually access, because basically most of it is in print, not an online format, but at least they have something they can use in that specific time. So this was definitely useful, and I would encourage my colleagues actually to look at this. If there's a possibility or end of the year fund or anything like that, they can spend on specific access to these resources. These are useful resources. And I see that there was a big jump from last year using these resources versus now, because this is the only available thing. Other than that, actually, I kept active communication with vendors in the Middle East. So I kept kind of informing them not to ship now at this time. And when we started resuming work, I asked them to start shipping whatever they had in the pipeline in the closure time. Also, I asked them about what is available, what is going on in their country, especially in Iran, where there was a lot of impact from COVID-19 in everyone's life. So I asked my vendors in Iran to tell me about what is the situation. Is there any kind of impact on low number of publications or less number of volumes coming out in Egypt, in Iraq, in all the areas that I'm dealing with, North Africa, and all of that. And actually, to be honest, I got the responses from them that they are in a stable situation. Some of them actually confirmed that they even have more resources than before. So in response to that, when I was asked to cut the budget, I made all or most of the cut actually in my discretionary funds versus the plans, because I wanted to keep getting these resources and I wanted to keep getting whatever we have, because I know from experience that if we miss something, this means that we will not be able to get it again. And if I do not do this, probably this would impact people in Yale, in Harvard, in UCLA, in some other places. So I wanted to make sure that these resources are kind of stable. They are coming in their same rate, and they are secure to come to serve Berkeley users as well as others when they enter library law and start reopening again. So this was one of the things that I did. In addition to that, actually, to speak also about technical services or technical processing, it was basically in Berkeley relying a lot on catalogers in place to do the work. But now we are thinking about having mark records from vendors, some kind of shelf-ready materials. So whenever there's a possibility for shelf-ready, we ask now vendors to provide the MRC files for anything that we get from them in any of the languages if they are available. So this is kind of what is going on at the moment now, and my ways of reacting to the cuts and reacting to the situation to make sure that there's not that much of damage in the collection that would happen after the pandemic. And now I can leave it or move it to Evyn to speak more.
I think we're going to move on at this point. Evyn, I think, already addressed this point a fair amount. So why don't we?
Sorry, I'm sorry. So I shouldn't respond to this. Is the second question?
I heard in your first response quite a bit about this. Do you have some brief remarks before we move to the next topic? No? Okay. So let's turn our attention now to rare materials. And the next question, which we'll look to Matt first and then Evyn to respond. Have your strategies for identifying and requiring rarely collected materials changed as a result of the pandemic? Are there examples of materials that are endangered either directly or indirectly by the COVID-19 situation that are being overlooked? So to Matt.
So Evyn alluded to this very well. No trips means it's really difficult to get at these kinds of materials that we're talking about here, rare materials. We had a really funny thing happen right during lockdown. Funny, not just like odd and a little scary. A curator was in another country looking at a collection that I'm going to describe in a minute, right when real lockdowns started in the US, including on flights coming in from a variety of countries. And the curator was in a country that it looked like might get locked down. So the head of the library had me order that curator to come home, right kind of in the middle of negotiations. The thing that I can say is that in the short term, some of these things that we had going are still in the works. Once we can get things shipped and conclude our negotiations, I think that in the short term, the rare materials that we were working on, for which we had already allocated funding, will probably come in. But we're going to start. Those things are going to have stopped very soon, and then we will not be bringing in new rare materials. So the collection that the bibliographer was working on is a collection of 1,250 manuscripts that are in Arabic, Persian, Pashto, and Urdu. And we are really hoping that we can get this collection to the US. I'm 60% confident that we're going to be able to make that happen, but no more than that. And so I see those materials as being at risk because the collector vendor that has these materials may very well decide to start selling them off individually instead of as a collection that we hope to bring in. And I want to prevent that, but I'm not sure that we can. And how many more of those kinds of collections are going to just, we won't be able to identify them at all until we can start traveling again. And it seems like really starting to travel is in the distant future, in part because of budgets, but I think more fundamentally because of just travel restrictions. So Evyn, go ahead. That's my preamble to your experience.
Yeah, thank you, Matt. So of course, pandemic or no, there is always the danger of overlooking or neglecting these materials if we are not deliberate and if we're not coordinated and collaborative in our collecting approaches and our resource allocations. And of course, this means not only for purchase, but also for travel. So funds for travel, as well as funds for cataloging, for preservation, for conservation treatment, for rehousing, for reformatting. That is once, especially once the material enters our stewardship, okay? And that is in addition to our selection strategies and context. And I would submit, should we be acquiring material if we are not prepared to invest the resources necessary to catalog it? And if we, of course, I mean, I feel it very important in the midst of all that is going on to consider the full sort of scope of these impacts. So traditional collecting or spiriting away materials may not be the only strategy, but collaborative engagement for local description, such as or digitization or rehousing or other preservation and access strategies might be what we choose to do, where we choose to invest our resources. And we're still able to rely on many of the same methods for identifying materials. Collectors, dealers, sellers are still active. Many of them are still sending along communications. Auctions are still being held. Actually, the Sotheby's, the UK sales are kind of raging next week. But of course, many lots are going unsold, and this is a very sort of how to say, this is a very sort of narrow layer at the at the head of the cream, if you will. But the pandemic impacts on travel and on transport and on shipment and on receipt. These are just monumental, and without this kind of access, there are many, many materials, as Matt has already said, that might not even come to light or come to our attention, let alone come available for us to purchase, come available for us to enter into negotiation around, or whatever arrangements necessary to ensure their preservation. There are many materials that are often offered only in-person at fairs, for example. Some of means are able to do virtual fairs, and some of these fairs have taken place actually quite recently, or are taking place now even. But of course, the materials which are in the inventories of smaller booksellers or are of very limited distribution or circulation, I mean, it's extremely difficult to even identify those. And insofar as spending or budgetary containment measures are impeding our sort of big ticket item purchases or purchases of physical materials as opposed to electronic, there's definitely an impact on acquiring rare, unique, or rarely collected items. So again, when it comes to many of these materials, we'll often prefer to review them first, physically examine them. That is very difficult under the circumstances, if not impossible. And as Matt has already said, conversations, negotiations that might lead to these acquisitions have also stalled or slowed or just completely cut off, owing to the impacts on travel and also the impacts on operations of law offices or or other other crucial collaborators in the work. So again, it's just extremely important that we continue to adopt collaborative and coordinated strategies to ensure these materials are preserved.
Great, that's a great segue actually into the next question, which I'll address first to Michael and then to Mohamed. So what new collaborative collection development efforts regarding Middle East studies materials may be surfacing in response to the pandemic? Are there any specific partnerships, policies, or strategic opportunities being considered at your institution? Michael.
So first off, apologies for sort of reading. I want to get my comments out and not go over time. So I'm going to read what I've put together. So at the U of A, unfortunately, we don't really have the luxury right now of considering opportunities. We need to pursue something quickly, even if it's a stopgap. We lost our Middle Eastern specialist about 3 years ago, and having not been given approval to hire individually for the position, we've included linguistic and disciplinary knowledge of the greater Middle East as preferred qualifications in a number of hires since then, but unsurprisingly have not had much luck. So in the interim, we've been getting by giving this additional work to a seasoned liaison librarian without any linguistic expertise and with a lot of other duties, and with the help of a cataloger who happens to know Arabic. But I've learned recently that this staff member will now be retiring in February, so I've got to come up with another arrangement. So in response, working with Sharon Smith up at ASU, Arizona State University, I've developed a proposal to their administration to leverage her expertise to serve both institutions, with U of A paying for the content and cataloging and them supplying her time and expertise for selection. The plan would be to avoid duplicating what is acquired by either institution in order to broaden access to a wider range of content to scholars at both institutions and beyond. Thus far, this proposal is still just that, a proposal, but we're still early in the process. I'm also looking into potentially leveraging the skills and knowledge of staff from our Center for Middle Eastern Studies, many of whom are polyglots, sometimes with one or more advanced degrees, and who know the research of their faculty quite well. They also tend not to have a particular focus of interest, which can be a problem when you're engaging faculty in this kind of work. So that's something that I may look to if other things fall through. My longer term hope, though, regardless of the mechanism we find to do the selection, is to try to pivot away from purchasing broadly but shallowly, acquiring much of the same content as our peers, and instead intentionally map out a narrower area within which to more deeply collect and retain content on behalf of the broader community. And while this will result in delays in access for some materials for our scholars locally, it may also help us to rationalize the expense and continued focus on print in post-COVID times. With the level of cuts in staffing and collections that are precipitating from the COVID crisis, as well as the hyper-focus it has brought on access to digital or digitized content, I worry about being able to retain funding and keep a focus on an area where we're primarily collecting in print and are collecting in a just-in-case manner in what has largely become a just-in-time world.
Thank you, Michael. Mohamed.
Thank you, Michael. This was very useful to kind of give a broader scope of what I will be kind of saying, but in a smaller scale on what I myself kind of experienced in terms of collaboration before, and also what is going on now in the UC system, and in particular also with the Stanford collaboration. So to respond to that question, UC system is kind of considered as one big entity of 10 campuses. And we usually deal with the situation in that regard in terms of collections and services. And even now we are moving to a new library system, which will be all the same in the 10 campuses. So when users will search the library catalog, it will not be Berkeley catalog, it will be the UC catalog. So it will be all the UC in this regard. So because of that, and because when the users actually will get into the record, they will know where this record is located or where this book is located. But from the first scene, they will know that this book is there. So it's either in UCLA or in UC Berkeley, UC Davis, UC Santa Barbara, whatever the book is available, whatever the material is available, it's in the UC system. So because of that, and because of all the history of collaboration, CDLG, which is collection development of, digital collections of California, it's the CDL, deals with electronic resources. There is a lot actually have been done in the past to kind of lead us to some fruitful results in the future. With the pandemic, because of what was going on in the whole country and also in the UC, they were all talking about, okay, let's look at what we can do together in terms of print as well. So what UCLA collects, what versus UC Santa Barbara versus UC Berkeley, what vendors we are using, and all of that. So this conversation has started actually, but not yet to the level where I say there is something in place to really do something. However, on the librarians level, before, I know that even before me at Berkeley, I know that there was a Middle East list of librarians in the UC to kind of talk about what we get from where, which vendor, and how UCLA probably will focus on something versus Berkeley and all of that. So it is kind of that situation where we are now looking at UC system collaboration, Stanford collaboration, so we can get, because approximately UC Berkeley and Stanford are very close in distance, we can just get something done. This actually reminds me of what have been done before between UNC, University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, and Duke University. They have a very good historical collaborative agreement. And I worked before with when I was at North Carolina in that capacity with my colleagues in Duke, Christoph Gully before, and now Sean Swanwick. They both actually worked together with me to really get to the details of the collaboration agreement. And in that regard, I would say that there are 4 levels of successful collaborative agreements between libraries in that regard. First one is the librarians level. So this includes our discussion as librarians. So when we talk about the details of the work, okay, I'm using Lila books and someone else is using LCL, MECAB, and someone else is using Iran Farhang versus someone else is using another vendor in Iran, and to make sure that we have all the coverage from all the areas, even if we are focusing on Persian studies in both places. So what it means to have 2 copies, probably 1 copy at UNC, 1 copy at Duke, 1 copy in UCLA, 1 copy in Berkeley, how this works, what this means actually. Is it a duplicate or this is a need that we need to have? So this is kind of the librarians discussion into the details about the work. And also what is known as one specific example for Princeton, definitely manuscripts and all the materials, rare items. This is really great. So in this regard, Princeton can focus on that versus other libraries can focus on other things. For Berkeley, it is known for Kurdish studies and focus on Kurdish. Definitely we can continue doing that versus UCLA focusing on something else, or Stanford focusing on Turkish materials. So it's kind of that situation. The second level I would say is the administration level. It is very important and crucial to tell everyone that even if we talk from now until next week as librarians, if there's no support or backing from the administration, nothing will happen. We will not, even if we ask for support, funding support, it will not happen before they say yes on something. And this is the level that we definitely need now. And we now see that the administration, library administrators are actually working or encouraging librarians to do that and to work more together, to work on collaborative agreements and see where they can save, where they can be more effective in one way or another. The other level is, or the third level is actually the user community level. So it was actually seen for me because UNC Duke agreement was historical and it was there for a long time. Even when I speak to faculty, their expectation that, oh, I know that I get this book from Duke. It's not UNC responsibility, I know. So this kind of make us feel relaxed about, okay, we are not every time the kind of explaining and saying the same thing. We do not collect in this area, or we selectively collect in this area. And if you need more of general extensive collection, go to this library or so on. So the user expectation is another way. And actually, if it comes from the administration, the librarians, and the library practice in general, or the library public relations in general, to say, oh, yes, we have an agreement, and the agreement is doing 1, 2, 3. So the users will know over the time that this is a situation, and they will develop that type of nature when they ask for something. This is what they can expect. The other thing that I would love to also mention here for a successful agreement or a successful collaborative agreement is the continuous assessment. So definitely we are not talking about something very static. We are talking about something very dynamic. So changes in program, changes in classes, changes in number of faculty, changes on research focus and scopes and all of that in both campuses. Probably if we talk about Stanford and Berkeley, definitely these are changing over time. And the agreement should also kind of reflect that change. So I think with all of that, this is where I believe the successful collaborative agreement should be and will be kind of effective in the future, respecting distinguished collections in places and all of that. And even with that, if it's not just about 2 campuses, it's also about the whole US as a country. For example, if someone knows that Kurdish is a focus in Berkeley, this means that I probably can rely on Untitled Library alone to get these resources from Berkeley because I know they are doing this. So they can focus on other things that I in Berkeley can benefit from. So it is that type of situation where we need to collaborate based on, and also to share the information about collaboration so we all know what is going on and can benefit from that. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Mohamed. And now, just to build on that, I'd like to ask first Michael and then Marlis to respond to our final question, which is what opportunities do you see to work together more effectively? For example, people use the same vendors such as the Library of Congress, Cairo office, Lila Books, etc. Are there ways to more effectively coordinate our collective activities to ensure resources are not being lost for future scholarship? So Michael and then Marlis.
Thank you. So as I mentioned before, I think it's critical for us to rapidly move away from collecting only for our own institutions and scholars and pivot to intentionally collecting for the broader scholarly community. Now, it's going to be difficult as it's been our focus for decades and it's what our faculty expect of us. Post-COVID, though, we need to retain our institution's focus and funding on area studies and vernacular content. But to do this, we're going to have to expand the breadth of what is acquired through coordinated collaborative action. If we don't, I think we risk the loss of funding and a significantly narrower corpus of vernacular content available to scholars in the future. The challenge is how to make changes that would seem to discount local needs in order to pursue broader communal goals. Selectors and even AULs may not have the standing or feel empowered to make those kinds of weighty decisions for their campuses and scholars. One potential way to help incentivize such a move could be through a change in the criteria for Title VI funding, away from how much is spent within libraries on materials or staffing for vernacular content, or how large the collections are, and toward the degree to which their activities result in enriching and expanding the corpus of vernacular content available to scholars system-wide. This kind of revision could potentially result in the acquisition of a broader range of materials in the areas of focus by institutions nationwide, by including participation in cross-institutional collaborative collection development and shared print initiatives as a criterion for grant funding. Such a change could help to increase the range of vernacular and area studies materials and ensure their ongoing availability to U.S. scholars and students, all without necessarily increasing costs for individual institutions. As we all know, the speed and ease with which research libraries in the United States can now fulfill interlibrary loan requests means that institutions should no longer have to invest in acquiring the same content for their scholars, especially highly specialized or foreign language materials that may also require specialized expertise to identify, acquire, process, and preserve. If these materials exist in any one of the dozens of major research libraries in the country, well-established resource sharing agreements and processes mean that a researcher can often gain access to the material at their home institution in less than a week with a few clicks of a mouse. However, absent a catalyst for the development of interinstitutional agreements and coordination, most libraries continue to collect in these areas expressly for local needs, resulting in the non-value-added duplication of lightly used materials and less rare or ephemeral content being collected. A change in the criteria, or even how the criteria are described, could have the effect of encouraging and legitimizing the kinds of agreements and coordination necessary for institutions to begin to more intentionally collect area studies materials at a network level. This current crisis could provide us with a unique opportunity to pursue such a change.
I'm up next. Yeah, so we've heard a lot of just really wonderful thoughts from Mohamed and from Michael about collaborative collection development. I want to sort of step back and almost sort of talk about the other side of the coin, which is that we may be so slick and efficient that we sort of paint ourselves into a corner if we get too efficient at collaborative collection development. And I want to talk just briefly about a town hall, which I suppose many of you are familiar with. It was held by the Ivy Plus town hall back on June 30th. It was called the Ivy Plus Analysis for Collaborative Collection Development Project. And, you know, not at all to throw any shade on Ivy Plus, who does wonderful things and is just carrying out all sorts of wonderful programs. But what just very briefly, they carried out evaluations of holdings, collections, use, and user behavior for a very small, specific subset of currently produced, recent monographs. And just as a gross oversimplification, basically the goal was to purchase as few copies as possible. Like, that was the overarching goal. And in a way that sounds like, well, that sounds like a good goal, because then you're saving money to buy other things. But just to pull out one statistic from their report, for the sample data set they came up with, they said 70% of the time, one copy would be sufficient to meet all the users' needs in the entire, in the entire United States. So if we get it down to, one library is buying one copy, that presents all sorts of, widening implications, and not least of which is the implications for our suppliers of vernacular materials in the Middle East. If we get ourselves so organized and slick that only one of us has to buy a copy of a book, then that's going to not work out for our vendors in the Middle East, who aren't going to be able to survive if only one library is buying a single copy. So I just want to also point out that, we have to sort of differentiate between sharing collections and, sharing collections from the point of view of lending, and sharing collections from the point of view of actually purchasing and establishing the collection. So of course, collaboration is great. Who's gonna say collaboration is bad? But you can't share a collection if you don't have a collection. And so I would, those of us some of us are in the position where they're only able to meet, just in time current purchase, current purchase access. And those of us who are in, have in a little more favorable position, we have our distinguished collections that we want to maintain. I think collaboration would be a good thing if we look to make sure to establish a minimum number of copies that are being purchased, rather than a maximum number of copies. So all of these collaborations that Mohamed was talking about, and Michael's talking about, that that's really great, but just taking a step back, I think we have to maintain the idea that we have to maintain our distinctive individual collections. I guess that's all I've got to say now. I'll turn that back to Judy.
Thank you very much. So right on time. I really appreciate all our panelists' commitment to kind of stick to time, and that has put us in an excellent position to have about 20 minutes for conversation. And I'll just turn it over to James. I think he's been keeping his eye on the chat, and he'll moderate the discussion.
Indeed. Thank you, Judy, and thank you to all the panelists for these tremendous reflections on the topic at hand. It is no surprise to anyone that when we proposed the panel discussion, we were envisioning that we'd be in a post-COVID world, thinking about some real issues that we wanted to address moving forward, that perhaps that the short-term effects were past us and the long-term effects would be in front of us. We are still, of course, in reaction mode, and that is something that we acknowledge as our institutions struggle to keep up with the demand and the changing realities of how we can supply and what we supply. So I wanted to certainly acknowledge that and acknowledge all of the work that every one of you attending today are doing in support of scholarship and in support of your local needs and the national needs, of course. This is there are profound impacts happening on campuses and across the research world and the research life cycle. And not all of them are going to be temporary. We've heard that from a variety of our speakers that we should be considering permanent change as a reality of our situations. If things get better, great, but the likelihood of that happening next fiscal year seems unlikely. There have been conversations, of course, across the research library ecosystem on these very challenges, and specifically around international collecting. MELA and you all have contributed important points of conversation into the national conversation on this issue, in terms of the importance of print, the importance of losing out potentially marginalized voices, and certainly those ephemeral materials that we've heard so much about here, including folks who are putting things into the chat. Pausing is not always the best option. We need to think about ways that we can turn this into an opportunity to at least mitigate the damages, if not come up with more effective systems to work together. CRL, of course, stands in support of the work of area and international studies, of the work in collecting primary source and secondary source materials from across the world. We are active participants in the identification and preservation of materials. So we thought it was important to open up this conversation as a precursor to larger discussions about what we can do. Like you, CRL was forced with some painful shutdowns and responses to the reality. We moved quickly, though, to respond to the scholarly community as well by opening up a wide variety of our electronic access collections to the world. And in fact, the use of our e-resources at CRL doubled as a result of the opening up of a wide variety of materials that we could put safely into the public under the defense of fair use. We also negotiated emergency access to a number of databases, including with Gale and EBSCO and Eastview Information Services. And we're going to continue those conversations of ways that we can more effectively help move electronic access forward in meaningful ways. And most importantly, participating in these community conversations and figuring out where we stand and where we need to go. And this is where you come in. CRL has been working towards setting up structures that will enable us to work more effectively with our area studies community towards a greater purpose of a rationalized, distributed collection responsibility for international and area studies materials. We're doing that in several ways, most importantly, working with our advisory and governance committees at CRL to stand up structures that will allow for that greater engagement. We've announced the activation of an international collections and content working group as part of CRL's formal governance structures to advise, guide, and implement strategies in support of the entire community, to support programs and special initiatives, and to liaise and provide guidance to CRL's international and area studies constituencies. Something we would love very much to do is to be able to take these conversations and pivot them into an action agenda on behalf of research libraries. And we intend to do that through a variety of community surveys and information collecting, looking at actionable data points, turning all of these anecdotal resources into something we can work on, and focus on ways that we can pivot this to action to support the work, including cooperative collection development. I can go into specifics, but I definitely want to leave time for some of the conversation here across the groups. But I did want to acknowledge just a few, and Mohamed, thank you very much for categorizing the types of cooperation. We saw examples of library to library collaboration, like Michael was describing, what Berkeley is doing, and what institutions are increasingly being forced to do as time goes on. But also at the system level is an important consideration. And then I did abstract it one higher to the network of systems, to this collective collections. There's important conversations happening now at the Big Ten Academic Alliance, and with the Ivy Plus, and with other groups. We need to figure out ways that we can better network across all of those institutions. And I would argue that starts with the intelligence that this community has, using the same vendors, using similar profiles, all of this information which can help inform transparency and strategy in cooperating more smartly in how we collect. And I'll agree with the comments made here and in the chat that narrowing it down to a single copy of every book available is probably not the most effective answer here. But there's plenty of room in the middle where we can more effectively reduce the level of duplication on that broad and shallow collecting and increase the level of the distinctiveness of lesser collected materials. We've been proving this with the South Asia community through the South Asia Cooperative Collection Development Workshops, using the Library of Congress as our trusted partner to share information and bringing people to the table to focus on the work of coordinating collections. It's an important step forward that I think we could scale to a much broader level. Let me just focus, turn back now to make sure that we have the opportunities to collect anybody's comments. You are certainly welcome to raise your hand and speak up. David Faust commented earlier, just to reiterate here that decisions that are made today are de facto decisions for the future of research. Focusing only on E, or perhaps missing some of the print, means those things are not going to be available for future research. Focusing on E would privilege certain aspects of research now and into the future where we're not considering all of the potential voices that are out there. That is definitely an important point to acknowledge and to try to accommodate in our reactions. What I also heard in here was that there aren't necessarily consistencies across the board at institutions or consistencies in publishing across the world either. So if anybody else in either the panelists or anybody in the audience wants to comment on any of these aspects, I'd welcome that now. And Judy suggested you can raise your hands. Do any of the panelists, just to kick us off, have questions of each other and anything you said? Or was there anything further that somebody wanted to pick apart? One of the things I wanted to suggest maybe is, Michael, you were focusing on the Title VI cooperation and tying cooperation to funding. That's a really intriguing point. It's a really intriguing point, and I'm not certain as to the status of the library's influence within that Title VI renewal cycle at this point. In the 90s, there was considerable momentum toward that, and I'm not sure there's still that strength.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, it was just a way that, funding, change behavior, and so when you can, signal something in funding, suddenly it's very easy to point to that, whether I'm an AUL or a dean or whoever. It's like, this is what we're doing because, that is going to put us in a better position to secure this funding or to keep our center being, a Title VI funded center. Those things matter, I think, when you're talking to a provost or things like that. And also just from the federal sort of level, the idea of, there had been the sort of focus within Title VI criteria on the availability of your content to independent or other scholars, as well as those within your institution. But, as we've changed and as things are much more available, it's well, why don't we just try to broaden what's available to scholars rather than just what I may happen to have within my institution? And yes, they can come in and they can use it on site if they want, or we will loan to another institution. That seems too narrow. And so, I just thought it would be a good way to go. I do think that it wasn't clear how to make these changes. I talked to some folks within Middle Eastern librarianship and within Slavic as well, but that's really kind of at the wrong level. It really needs to be perhaps within the scholarly community, or even just within those who are our legislators. So I wasn't sure how to go about doing that, but it's the idea of trying to find ways to have funding, influence behavior seemed like a good strategy. There may be others as well. That was just one that seemed like maybe it was doable. It was pretty small and might result in sort of a catalyst to get things moving in the right direction. James, are you aware of how those things change, of how that criteria is, because it's adjusted year after year, they will change the weighting of different categories and things. I don't know how that necessarily happens.
I confess to, I wouldn't know the specific details of how that happens. I know that there usually is some advisory period when they're reframing the criteria, and that there at one point was an association of folks who were focusing on those changes. If anybody else has better knowledge on that, it would be good to know. I will say, and somebody just jump in if they have something to add, but I will say that I saw Emily was on here earlier. Within the Africana applicants for the Title VI funding, there's a concerted effort to make sure that there is common language put forward by the libraries to the Title VI applications through the national, through the language centers, expressing collaboration as part of their stated mission, and asking for an allocation of funds be made in the Title VI budget towards cooperative library projects.
I believe in my couple of times actually participated in Title VI writing. There is some kind of focus on collaboration as well, and how the collections are used actually by campus users and as well as other users from outside. So there is kind of how the collection itself is kind of used from inside or outside, and how many people are using it, and how big it is, and how distinguished it is for the US, not just for your specific institution. It's actually one of the elements, it's not everything.
I believe I've covered most of the topic points that were put into the chat. So if there are anyone else that wants to contribute anything at this point, we welcome it. We've just got a few minutes left. So we're just a couple here that came in. Kaukab mentions that she's curious to hear from the group whether you have any suggestions or ideas regarding how to leverage existing collections or collection strengths for better access and research support. We heard a lot of good ideas regarding how to leverage future collections and future access, but are there pockets of strengths from past depths that we could tap into and leverage towards better scholarly support on this point? Let me just think, ask the panelists to consider this, but one of the aspects that I think is important here are the collections around remote storage and our shared print retentions, that most of our libraries are looking to outplace a lot of our collections into our remote facilities. And that's a point where collections may face long-standing life or permanent death, depending on how well they're described and how accessible they can be made. This is a crucial point for CRL and for a lot of our libraries, well beyond just the collecting side of things is how do we make sure that we're responsibly stewarding the materials for the future, but also making it accessible. So I don't know if Kaukab, if that's a point maybe that we can pick up on perhaps at a future discussion, because it's a big topic unto itself, but looking at ways that we can create systems to make that material more widely exposed, but actually build towards something greater, which is our vision, which is building the systems that will allow that shared print retention to be built into the entire life cycle, so that when we're thinking about acquisition of materials, we're eventually thinking about the long-standing stewardship of that materials. That requires a lot of infrastructure, but that's maybe a separate topic that we can talk about next year. Other folks?
I think there was a question from Iman about the importance of digital projects at this time or the pandemic, and I definitely agree that this is definitely the time to think about that more seriously and to digitize more resources, because now we see that definitely access to electronic resources or more digitized items is easier in the time being, and it will be definitely also very useful in the future, even if the situation returns back to normal.
William Capecchi picked up on the remote storage conversation to think about the challenges of the time to delivery. And that is definitely a big issue, just both in terms of costs. And I know a number of libraries are turning to the concept of controlled digital lending as a possibility for action in this area. Again, this is an important legal decision and a copyright issue that many of our libraries are standing behind or watching closely. I think that there's plenty of space to have continued conversations in that area as well, which is, at what point do you scan that material? You know, could it be at the point of acquisition, or even at the point of the vendor? You know, dare say the Library of Congress, perhaps, making that content electronically accessible. I'm just throwing that down.
Others may be more up on this than, probably are more up on this than I am, but my understanding is that as of now, the controlled digital lending just is not very robust. I mean, that it's really difficult there are all sorts of obstacles to lending e-materials to other libraries. And that seems to me like that would be such a crucial breakthrough if that was able to happen. I mean, others probably know more about this, but just recently, you know, we had a meeting on another subject at the library, and our you know, lending people basically said, no, it's really not it's not yet in a good place. And everybody's talking about it, of course, but it hasn't happened yet, as far as I know. Maybe others know more.
Actually, I think right now Internet Archive is having a Zoom that I had to miss because it's during this period of time. But I do know, I think the critical piece is that for research libraries, unlike Open Library with Internet Archive, that is basically just trying to get their hand on whatever they can and send it all out there, regardless of if it's Harry Potter or something that is really obscure. I think research libraries are interested in controlled digital lending for the content that is unavailable and will likely remain unavailable in digital format unless we do something about it. And it's this stuff published in the 20th century that's maybe on, you know, paper that's falling apart, languishing in their stacks someplace, and there's not going to be a commercial viability to this. And so the risk of legal action is extremely low for something like that. But the benefit to opening that up and the space it could free up in our libraries if we were able to do that, since, you know, these are very low used materials, but maybe, you know, somewhat widely held, is, you know, I mean, there's potential there. I really wish that Internet Archive would basically license their platform, you know, to academic libraries so that we could do it the way that we want to, in a way that is, you know, we could be as risk averse as HathiTrust is with the ETS program, which I think is quite risk averse, but they're doing it well because they're not going to get sued. But I mean, if we, you know, had a good platform to be able to do that, I think it's a really exciting idea. Not so much for proactively things that we purchase that puts, you know, that compromises vendors, compromises authors, but things that are now unavailable for purchase that really could be, you know, leveraged. You could leverage section 108H, I think it is, you know, that basically says if something's unavailable, you know, you can make a digital copy for a user if they need it. So I think it's a really interesting idea, but I think it's, what are we going to use it for, and why does it work for us and it's legally sound for us when perhaps it may be different for others? And so I'm watching the case that's moving forward closely, but it's really a very different case than would be if one were ever brought against academic libraries for doing something, because we probably wouldn't be, you know, scanning and uploading Harry Potter, you know, for people to read.
Well, I think this has been a rich field of ideas to put together, and I thank you all for your comments. And I know that the chat is being saved and the session is being recorded. Judy, am I turning this back over to you? she's just gonna click leave. Robin, I think is our host here. So let me just thank once more our distinguished panelists for your time, for your expertise, and for your thoughts. We are going to continue this conversation, of course, in many different avenues and pursuits across the international and area studies groups, but also with the broader CRL membership in the coming months. So look forward to that. And I do commend the series that Berkeley is putting together about librarians speaking, and Yale and other folks who are really bringing the community together in interesting ways. So thank you all for participating today.
Okay. Okay, I guess I will wrap things up. Thanks everybody for attending. Fantastic conversation and fantastic comments as well in the chat. And I guess I will bring this meeting to a close, and thank you very much to Judy and to James for organizing this, and to all of our wonderful participants, some of whom I'm meeting for the very first time. So we hope to see you again in the future. All right, everybody take care. Have a good evening, night, morning, wherever you are.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you, Evan. Thank you, Marlis. Good to see you all.